Hi there, Social Studies 30-1 here again. We're moving on with our look at the Cold War. We're actually into part 4, part B. I don't know why I just didn't call them parts 4 and 5. Anyway, this is a continuation from our class yesterday in which we were looking at, among other things, the proxy wars. And as we talked about, a proxy war is the way the superpowers fought each other without actually fighting each other. Again, the superpowers, America representing democracy and capitalism, Soviet Union representing communism and dictatorships. And so those two superpowers fight each other by using someone else's country and by and large someone else's people. That is the nature of a proxy war. An ideological showdown without actually shooting at each other. And as horrible as that sounds, I can understand why it worked out that way. The last thing you would want during the Cold War is an American soldier shooting a Soviet soldier and killing him, triggering World War III that could go nuclear, etc., etc. So I could see why it went down that way, but it's still a very sad way of looking and thinking about the world, using other people, killing them so you're not killing your own soldiers. That is a big part of the proxy war. So we looked at proxy wars in Korea, we looked at proxy wars in Vietnam, and basically what it amounted to in those two proxy wars, uh, uh, a communist part of one country was trying to take over the non-communist part of that same country. So North Korea invades the South, trying to unify all of Korea under communist rule. Same thing in Vietnam. North Vietnam invades South Vietnam, trying to unite all of Vietnam under communist rule. The Americans would not let them. And that, of course, is the Truman Doctrine. Um, Another doctrine you'll learn today is going to be the Brezhnev doctrine that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. So those were the two big proxy wars we looked at. There's a lot of them. I mean, there's dozens of them. We can't study all of them, obviously, but we can look at some of the bigger ones that really shaped the course of history. So today what we'll move on to will be proxy wars in the Americas and Afghanistan as well. So we'll start with Central and South America. Most people don't know this. Most Americans don't know this. This is very interesting. Um, Time after time in Central and South America, there were communist revolutions, or there were nations that were on the verge of a communist revolution. And in every single case except for one, the Americans put down that communist revolution. And the reason why they're doing that, let's see if I've got a map here. Yeah, here's the Western Hemisphere. And so the American contention is that the Western Hemisphere is the American sphere of influence. The Western Hemisphere had been under the American sphere of influence for a long time, as far back as the Monroe Doctrine of the 1800s, which basically stipulated the Western Hemisphere is American territory, it is their sphere, do not meddle with the Western Hemisphere. And that way of looking at the world, the Western Hemisphere, belongs to not America directly, but under the American influence, was very exaggerated during the Cold War. So you had part of the world under the Soviet sphere. The Americans become very protective and concerned about their sphere, which is the Western Hemisphere. So obviously North America, Central America, and down here South America. And so, occasion after occasion, there would be burgeoning communist revolutions or out and out successful communist revolutions that the Americans would go in, they would use force, they would put down those communist revolutions because they can't stand the thought of communism in their backyard and their sphere of influence. And it's as simple as that. The Americans missed the boat on one occasion and they paid for it. America was late to do anything about the Cuban Communist Revolution in 1959. And maybe they learned a lesson from that encounter. They didn't act quick enough to stop the spread of communism, and before they knew it, Cuba had fallen to communism, and there was nothing really America could do about it. Cuba fell under the Soviet sphere, even though Cuba, here back on our map, even though Cuba is in very close proximity to America. You can see how close it is. They failed to act, and of course, that triggered the Bay of Pigs. They tried to overthrow Castro. They couldn't. It failed, and eventually culminated with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then America realized we got to let Cuba go. There's nothing we can do about it. And so maybe they learned a lesson from Cuba, because on the other occasions, America acted very quickly and they prevented and stopped communist revolutions: Chile, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras. Haiti actually voted for a socialist communist government, and the Americans wouldn't tolerate it, wouldn't let it stand. And so they sent in troops, overthrew that communist government, and instilled their own system, which didn't do Haiti any favors. If you know much about Haiti, it's a tough, tough place to live in. Um, the last thing they needed was America meddling in its history and territory. And so we'll go back to our map, and we'll see that by and large, um, this American action took place in Central America, and then of course the Caribbean. Here's Haiti over here. There's other examples of these proxy wars in Central and South America, but I think, we've made the point. One other point that we should also make while we're talking about that is really important, in that the American government, rather than tolerate and put up with a communist regime in their backyard, would actually aid fascist coups that would overthrow the communist governments for them. And so on every single one of these occasions, except for Cuba, what the Americans would do is they never actually sent troops. But what they did do was they went to the opposition of these communist regimes that were taking over or had taken over. And they would go to the opposition, and the opposition always seemed to be a fascist regime. And they would take that fascist regime, they would give them money, food, weapons, and they would train their soldiers. And they would use that fascist regime to undertake a coup. A coup is an overthrow of a government. So they would aid these fascist regimes. The fascist regime would overthrow the communist government, get rid of them, and then that fascist regime would now be in charge. And on every single occasion as well, that fascist regime would go on its own bloodletting campaign. They would kill hundreds or even thousands of innocent people that had been associated with the previous communist government. Women, children, families, civilians were murdered by the thousands by these fascist regimes after they toppled the communist government. And so it just makes you wonder, what was the whole point? And that if you truly think that communism is evil and you don't want it, and that's the reason why you hate it, why would you allow a fascist regime to do the same things that the previous communist regime you thought would be doing? Why did they even let that happen? That's always puzzled me. It's probably more they hated the ideology than anything. They couldn't stand the thought of the communist ideology. And maybe that's why they did what they did. But I just found it really ironic in that if you as an American government believe the sitting communist government in Nicaragua is evil, why would you topple them and put in a different evil regime that'll do the same things you thought the communist government was doing in the first place? And then, oddly enough, we haven't even considered it. It's very possible that communist government wasn't evil as you thought in the first place. Maybe they were actually trying to help their people. But again, it was more of the principle of the ideology probably that America couldn't tolerate, and that's why they did what they did. Oddly enough, I was reading an article a couple of years back, and there was a man caught in Calgary. He was running some kind of karate studio or something. I don't know, something like that. And anyway, he was actually in charge of one of the death squads in El Salvador in the 80s that was eliminating the communist regime and killing civilians. I'm not quite sure whatever happened to him. I think he was taken back to El Salvador to face charges for his crimes. Anyway, a little tidbit for you. Other proxy war we'll look at will be a little different. This is actually going to be more of a direct Soviet proxy war, Afghanistan 1979 to 1989. This one is very complicated. It's quite convoluted, so make sure you pay attention. But you'll learn a lot from it. Afghanistan had always been a Soviet satellite. Afghanistan had always been a communist state that was under the Soviet sphere of influence. In 1979, they tried to break away. So in 1979, Afghanistan tries to break away from Soviet domination. And of course, the Soviets predictably do what you would expect them to do. They invade Afghanistan to bring back and save the previous communist regime. Um, we call this the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine means you're not leaving the communist bloc. You're not breaking away from your association with Soviet communism. So the Soviets invade in 79, and they actually put soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. So it's important to note that in Afghanistan, Soviet soldiers get there first to bring back the communist government. And what that means is now the Americans can't land soldiers because, of course, the last thing they would want to see would be Americans shooting at Soviets directly. But the Americans can help the opposition to the Soviets, and they were known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were Afghanistan freedom fighters, and they were fighting for the independence of Afghanistan. They would have been the rebels fighting the Soviets during this proxy war of the 1980s. There's a picture of the Mujahideen on the screen right now. Afghanistan freedom fighters. So what the Americans could do, the Americans can't send soldiers, Soviets got there first, but they can help the Mujahideen. So again, they give them weapons, they give them supplies, they train their soldiers. What they give them above all else that really helps them is the Stinger missile. A Stinger missile is a SAM, a surface-to-air missile. And so all it really was, it was a rocket launcher, a bazooka that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. And all it would take is one well-placed shot to bring down a Soviet helicopter. And some of these helicopters are big. They're nearly as big as your house. And anyway, with American help, with the Stinger missiles, um, the Afghanis actually fight the Soviets to a standstill. The Mujahideen actually won that proxy war. Soviet Union fought for 10 years. They tried, but they could never topple the Mujahideen. The Soviet Union, in other words, lost this proxy war. The Brezhnev Doctrine failed in terms of Afghanistan, and it changed the course of history. Now, there were a lot of reasons why the Soviets couldn't win in Afghanistan. Um, a lot of them are the same reasons as to why the Americans lost in Vietnam. The Soviet military wasn't built for the kind of war they fought in Afghanistan. They weren't built for guerrilla warfare tactics. Not to mention, um, and it's a big lesson you learn in 30-1. I'm not sure you can kill an idea. I'm not sure you can kill an ideology. You can kill the people that believe in that idea, and you can kill the people that maybe invented the idea, but I'm not sure you can kill an idea because it's not a physical thing that you can kill. And so, try as they might, the Soviets could never defeat the Mujahideen, and they lost their grip in Afghanistan because of guerrilla warfare, etc., etc. And as well, don't forget that the Soviet Union was crumbling by the late 1980s. They didn't have the money for the war any longer. Their hearts just weren't in it, and they had to let it go. And so they lose that proxy war. Interesting historical side note now. One of the Mujahideen that the Americans were helping was Osama bin Laden. Now, he wasn't an Afghanistan by birth. Bin Laden actually was a Saudi Arabian who went to Afghanistan to help the cause of the Mujahideen. And it was the American CIA that was training the Mujahideen, giving weapons to the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. So, ironically enough, being one of the Mujahideen, the American CIA actually helped train and finance bin Laden in his early years. And then, if we skip forward to 2001, bin Laden becomes, arch enemy number one for America because he was the mastermind behind 9/11, of course. So just an ironic twist in history. Outcome for the 1990s for Afghanistan, the Taliban now take over. And so while they did drive out the Soviets, the Mujahideen, Afghanistan was left politically unstable and had always been economically impoverished. So that power vacuum was now filled by the Taliban. You've probably heard of the Taliban. They are a radical theocracy in Afghanistan. A theocracy is a religious dictatorship. So the Taliban take over in the 1990s and they rule with an iron fist. We would call the Taliban terrorists. They would call themselves freedom fighters. It's all about perspective and where you stand on the issue. But under Taliban rule, under Taliban law, which is a very strict interpretation of the Quran, women weren't allowed to go to school. Women couldn't have jobs. Punishment was very cruel. It was very physical in terms of abuse and so on. And it was actually the Taliban the Taliban government in Afghanistan that allowed Osama bin Laden to recruit and train his troops to fight the Americans during the War on Terror. And so things had come full circle for the Americans. The people they once helped drive out the Soviets during a proxy war had now turned on them and become, they're one of their number one enemies. And so America actually had to invade Afghanistan in 2001 with the UN to topple the Taliban and remove them as a threat. So there can't be a 9/11 Part 2, things like that, etc. Anyway, I told you Afghanistan was going to be complicated, and it is. It wasn't, it still is today. But there's a proxy war. So we've got proxy wars in Central and South America, Afghanistan. Of course, we learned about Vietnam and Korea just yesterday. You have enough information about proxy wars. You can understand them. There are still proxy wars today. You could argue that the war in Syria is a proxy war. There probably always will be proxy wars. All right. Cold War can't go on forever, and it doesn't. So what we'll start doing now is we'll start looking at the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and it's not going to take long. It starts with the summit meetings of the mid-1980s. Of course, Ronald Reagan is the American president, and Mikhail Gorbachev is the general secretary of the Soviet Politburo. He's in charge of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev inherits an economy in 1983 that is in serious trouble. And we learned this in chapters 5 and 6. Economically, the Soviet Union is, well, it's on its deathbed. The economy was unproductive. There was unemployment. There wasn't much consumption or production. The economy had stagnated. And when an economy stagnates again, it doesn't grow as fast as it used to, and in some cases, it begins to even retract. So you would measure a healthy economy maybe can grow 2% a year, and that's a good healthy number. If an economy grew at only, say, 1.5% a year when it used to grow at, what, 2%, that economy would be in trouble. It would be in a recession. What's going on in the Soviet Union by this time is the economy is actually growing, it may be minus 1%. It's actually in a retraction. So there's an economic crisis in the former Soviet Union that always leads to a political crisis. So Gorbachev has inherited the Soviet economy. It's in serious trouble. It's on the ropes, and he knows it. Um, so does Reagan. So Reagan is well aware of the weakness of the Soviet economy, and he puts the screws to the Soviets even more. So what Reagan does, it's interesting. In the 1980s, Reagan finances what is known as Star Wars, or SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars was the nickname. And what it was is Reagan spent billions of dollars in developing a system by which American satellites would orbit the Earth. There would be this big network of American satellites orbiting the Earth. These satellites would be armed with lasers. And the plan was that these satellites would be so sophisticated that if the Soviet Union ever launched its missiles at America, these satellites armed with lasers would detect the missile launch and shoot them out of the sky with the lasers, which would virtually end the Cold War because it's rendered the Soviet nuclear arsenal useless. They wouldn't be able to attack the Americans. Both sides had spent billions of dollars in trying to outdo the other. So basically, what it means, the Americans get the nuclear bomb first, and then the Soviets build their nuclear bomb, which is a bigger one. And so then the Americans build nuclear missiles, and then the Soviets build nuclear missiles. It culminated with, it's best exemplified by the space race, this outdoing one another. Soviets get to space first. They send an astronaut up into space, and he orbits the Earth in a satellite, Sputnik. And so then the Americans become the first country to win the race to the moon. As you know, in 1969, America lands on the moon, and they outdo the Soviets that way. And that's how you need to look at the Cold War. It was a series of one-upmanship. They do this, so you do that. And they do this, so you do that. You can't lose to the other guy. Star Wars was probably the nail in the coffin in terms of the one-upmanship. Um, Gorbachev had two choices. If the Americans have spent billions of dollars on developing Star Wars, Gorbachev can do one of two things. He can either match or eclipse and go beyond Star Wars, whatever that would be, whatever invention that might involve to neutralize Star Wars, or option two, he can give up. Given that they have no money anyway, and given that they can't keep spending money, Gorbachev opts to give up. He gives up on the Cold War, he throws in the towel, and that is known as glasnost. Glasnost means he's gonna open up to the West. He's going to make friends with America. And he's smart. He's probably better off in getting the Americans as a trading partner than he is trying to outspend them. He will never outspend the Americans, and he recognizes that. So why not just join them? The old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. Well, that kind of works here to a point. So Glasnost was a political measure. He's going to befriend the Americans. He needs their currency. He needs their investment in his economy. At this point, he's trying to save communism. Perestroika, we learned about already. It's more economic. And as we learned, it is a restructuring of the Soviet economy. It's allowing for a little bit of capitalism to try and save communism. Ironically enough, you'll chuckle at this. Um, think back to Star Wars, that system of satellites armed with lasers to shoot down the Soviet satellite or missiles. Um, Ironically enough, Reagan and the Americans never built one satellite armed with a laser. It was only ever just an idea. He spent billions on developing the plans and the blueprints, but they never actually made one functioning satellite with a laser. But I guess, in the end, they didn't have to. The mere idea of Star Wars, and that if they kept spending, they probably could have made it work, forced Gorbachev to throw in the towel and give up. So, oddly enough, people often would credit Ronald Reagan with ending the Cold War. Yeah, I guess that's true to a point. He was probably more just lucky at the time, though. Probably true credit for ending the Cold War should be given to Jimmy Carter. But we already talked about that. And then upon, the Glasnost Perestroika, both sides begin talking about not building any more weapons and maybe even starting to get rid of some of the weapons they've already got. Arms reduction. And that's going to cause a big problem. It's one thing, it's easy to stop making more nuclear weapons, but what do you do with the ones that you've already made? Estimates said that between America and the Soviet Union, they had produced enough nuclear weaponry to wipe out the world's population some 12 times over. Um, and it just makes you wonder if you can do it one time over, why do you need 12 times? Well, they had. So they have all of this weaponry. They could wipe out the planet 12 times over. What do you do with those weapons now? Easy to stop making more, but what do you do with the ones you've already got? And so what happened was a lot of them were sold. They began to destroy a lot of them too, and it's a hard, expensive thing to do. I mean, radiation, nuclear technology is very poisonous. It lasts a long time. And so the conundrum was solved by dismantling all of the bombs and the missiles under supervision of either side. And a lot of it is still going on. Anyway, moving on. The Soviets look weak. They looked weak after losing in Afghanistan. Glasnost and Perestroika also make them look weak. And so, sensing the blood in the water, sensing Soviet weakness, the satellite states, think back to our satellite states we learned about in part one. So, on our map here, the countries that are striped are Soviet satellite states. They look independent on a map, but they're not really. It's really the Soviet Union calling the shots. And don't forget that in 56, Hungary tried to break away. Soviets invaded, wouldn't let them. In 68, Czechoslovakia tried to break away. Soviets invaded, wouldn't let them. But times are different by the late 1980s. The Soviet Union looks weak, and the satellites know it. And so one by one, these satellite states begin to break away from the control of the Soviet Union. The first one to do it is Poland in the late 1980s under what is known as the Solidarity Union. So basically, Polish solidarity meant workers, unions unite. and they go on strike in the name of political reform and democracy. The Soviets by this point are weak. There's nothing they can really do about it. And so Poland breaks away as the satellite country first. So Poland's the first nation to break off from the Soviet Union. The other satellites watch this and then they break away from the Soviet Union too. Germany goes next, and then Hungary, and so on. And so the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989. Think back to the Berlin Wall lesson and how it was the focal point and symbol of the Cold War. Well, in November of 1989, they actually physically tear that wall down and they unify Berlin and the two Germanys. And that was the real symbol that the Cold War had come to an end. Most people could not believe it. I could not believe it. I was in university at the time. And I had to watch the TV for a while to get my mind to believe what my eyes were seeing. No one ever thought this was going to happen. So one by one, the satellite countries break away, and there's nothing the Soviet Union can do about it. And now the Soviet Union looks even more weak because it can't stop this from happening. And then very soon after that, the republics would declare their independence. Do I have a map? Yeah, here we go. Here we go. Excuse me. So here's a map, and all of these blue countries, so Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we call them the Baltic states. Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, all of these light blue countries didn't even exist during the Cold War. The people were there, the language was there, the ethnicities were there, but they did not have any political independence. They were part of the Soviet Union. So take a look at this map, find Ukraine, see Belarus, and so on. And here's our map of the Cold War. You can see like the Ukraine should be kind of right here, but it doesn't exist. The Baltic states don't even exist up top here. And that's what I mean by they had zero political independence. They had no sovereignty. So those are what we call the former republics of the Soviet Union, all of these light blue ones. Well, they watch the satellite states break away, and they're inspired by that political movement. So beginning in 1991, the former republics begin to break away from the Soviet Union. And there's nothing the Soviet Union can do about it. They all break away one by one. And now you've got the true end of the Soviet Empire, the true end of the Soviet Union. Just as a bit of a sidebar, Mikhail Gorbachev was kidnapped in 1991 by some hardcore Soviet communists. They believed that his reforms, glasnost and perestroika, went too far and had weakened the Soviet Union. And so, to try and bring back communist control, these hardcore communists kidnap Gorbachev and hold him hostage until he changes his mind about glasnost and perestroika. But there's no going back. Gorbachev is rescued by his rival Boris Yeltsin, and that was the end of the Soviet Empire. So if we go back to our map, you can see the unraveling of the former Soviet Union. All you have left by the end is Russia, and that's how it stands today in the former Soviet Union. One last interesting sidebar to you'll get a chuckle out of this too. Um, the Soviet Union crumbled on New Year's Eve, 1991, which, by the way, was the day that I moved to Calgary from Edmonton. And I remember walking down, I lived in downtown, I actually lived on 6th and 8th. This must have been 20, 25, 26 years ago. And I remember walking down the street and at a Mac store, I saw the newspapers. People still read newspapers back then. And the headline was the crumbling of the Soviet Empire. I remember buying the paper and reading it. I really should have saved the copy because it's, would be an historical memento by this point. But anyway, that's the night that I moved to Calgary from Edmonton, the night the Soviet Union crumbled. And it was cold. I remember it must have been minus 37, minus 38 at night. And so that night I plugged my car in my downtown apartment because it was cold. And I woke up the next morning and someone had stolen the plug-in. Car wouldn't start, so I had to get it boosted. Bought a new plug-in, and this time I got smart. I, I parked my tire on top of the cord so no one could steal the plug-in. Next morning, I wake up, go to my car. The car is gone. Someone had stolen my car. I got that car for my graduation in 1987, my Mustang. I was brokenhearted. Welcome to Calgary, huh? Anyway, they eventually found the car. It was parked in the parking lot at Marlborough Mall. And I got the car back, but it was never quite the same again. But that's the night the Soviet Union crumbled, was the day that I moved to Calgary. And that will always be ingrained in my mind. So there you have the story of the Soviet Union. In the old days, we would have spent about 2 weeks on this, but they changed the curriculum. We spent 5 days on it, and that's all we need for now, I guess. The Cold War, it just changed the scope of history. It changed the direction of history in that it created a world of two superpowers, and America was really the one superpower left after the Cold War. Things are changing now. China looks very much like they're going to at least rival, if not eclipse, the Americans. Russia has seen a resurgence since Putin took over a few years back. And so the world, might be entering a new era of tension between one superpower and the other superpower. Probably that tension is going to come between America and China. And all we can do is watch and see how it turns out. I've read articles that said at the very least China will rival America, but I've also read articles that say that China probably has overtaken America. After all, their economy grows more every year than America. And many historians believe America might actually be going into a bit of a decline. And probably it is compared to its stature in the 1990s and early 2000s. Um, anyway, all we can do is watch, and you'll be a grown-up adult on your own by the time we know the true answer to that. But I hope you'll always think about the Cold War and how it kind of set the world between one side against the other side, and it completely shaped history for about 40 years. Anyway, thanks for listening to that. I hope you gained something from that. There aren't many more lessons to go. Um, Next lesson or next assignment is actually going to be, it's going to involve you. Well, I don't want to ruin the surprise. I'll leave it at that.